Welcome back to the Youth Rights Podcast by the National Youth Rights Association. I am somebody you haven't seen before. I am Ramon. Zane couldn't make it today. I am on the board of NYRA as a writer and editor for the blog. I became interested in youth rights when I was a youth and invested especially in self-directed education. I joined NYRA after my alma mater, Simon's Rock College, shut down, and that kind of avenue towards youth rights for me became unavailable. And I'm here with Susan and Imogen paneling with me from NYRA.
Should I just introduce myself? Okay.
Yeah, go.
Hi, I'm Imogen. I was in the first this podcast. I went to a self-directed school for 7 years and then transitioned into unschooling. So that's kind of where my interest in this stuff started. And I'm a big fan of Devon Price, so I'm excited to be doing this.
So I am Susan. I've also been on this podcast before. I've been interested in youth rights since I was a young child, raised two kids in self-directed education, one of them being Imogen, who is now interested in youth rights too. So it's great that we can be a team doing this. And also a huge fan of all of Devon Price's work. So Devon, like, such a huge honor to have you here. This is amazing. Thanks for coming. And with that, I guess we'll have Devon introduce itself. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Devon Price. I'm a social psychologist. I'm a professor at Loyola University Chicago. I've written a lot of books about neurodiversity and kind of disabled liberation stuff. And in the last couple of years of my career, I've gotten really interested in a lot of youth liberation work. I think as I kind of grow in my anarchism a lot, like I've kind of steadily become more and more radical the more I pull at the threads of a lot of the things I'm interested in. So if anything, I'm kind of the most green to this topic, honestly, but I'm so glad to connect more with people that are doing work in things like family abolition, unschooling, youth liberation, and just talking about kind of deinstitutionalizing how we take care of one another and our responsibilities to one another in as many ways as possible. So yeah, really happy to be here.
Yeah, you mentioned just now introducing yourself about anarchism, and that was something I was very interested to talk to you about in this context, because a lot of the work we do is very policy focused, and one things I really like about your writing is the kind of turn towards idealism, like big picture theory. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how anarchism has informed the way you look at youth rights.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think for those who learned like really deep in the weeds on anarchist stuff, I think the word has a particular connotation that can be very scary or just seem very impractical and things like that, or counter to thinking about things like policy or engaging with our existing systems. But I would say that anarchism for me is all predicated on this idea that we can empower people to make their own decisions. And that includes children, that includes disabled people. It's rooted in a faith in people's competence and that every person is the expert on their own life circumstance. And so we are being more anarchist in that sense anytime we move towards a more direct democratic process, anytime we give people more ability to decide what happens to their own lives and their own bodies and kind of challenge institutional control over other people. So I don't think it's necessarily in conflict with thinking about kind of the nuts and bolts of like very specific legal rights that we can give to youth and advocate for youth to have and ways for them to participate in the political process as it stands right now. In the same way that like lobbying to like deinstitutionalize how like intellectually disabled people are treated and kind of abolishing bedtime at institutions and abolishing institutions that treat people like prisoners and prisons are all part of that same kind of larger political project of saying, actually, you know, a lot of our legal system is rooted in this idea that like human nature can't be trusted, that we have to use power to force people to make the right decisions and to take care of themselves. And that same logic is especially applied to children, right? That they're seen as not full people, that they can't be trusted to, declare what they believe, what they care happens to their body, to say no to things, to say yes to things, to seek out their own education. And the anarchist idea is saying that no, actually, that is always where it begins. A person's life is their life, and we have a responsibility to help look after one another and empower people to do what they want with their life and their body.
You've talked about like the dignity of risk and how important that is. And I know like a lot of people like can support youth making their own decisions until it's like, oh, maybe this could be the wrong one, and then they'll take it away when I'm like, no, like being able to make a decision that could be wrong is part of being human.
Yeah, the dignity of risk is something that is
Yeah,
so
as you
fraught,
said.
especially in conversations about trans youth. For example, it's used as such a battering ram against the ability for people to self-determine what happens in their own lives when they are young, and kind of what you're saying, people's resistance to that idea, it's as if there is a right decision, right? And there is no single right decision for somebody to make with their life. And there's only the decision that is fitting for who you are at that moment in time. And all have regrets. We all have ways in which we change as a person over the course of time. And that's not really an argument to limit a person's freedom. And I think a lot of times when people do get really uncomfortable and squirrely about, oh, we can't let this young person make a decision about, let's say, getting on birth control or getting on puberty blockers or getting a tattoo or whatever it is, a lot of it is just saying, I personally or my society views that decision that they're making as an unusual one or one that pushes against kind of societal norms. And so we're going to be way more conservative about letting, quote unquote, somebody make that decision because it runs counter to what society already values. Whereas if somebody was making kind of the typical decision for that time, nobody's challenging that. Nobody even sees that as a decision because it's treated as so neutral. So there's so much that like denying risk to children and other, I think, marginalized groups of people, it's really about just kind of reinforcing whatever the existing norms in society are, because those are the choices that people actually feel are risky or feel are not acceptable, are the ones that they personally don't want that person to be making.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, that's so true in the world of education. There's with school, if you're going to public school, all kinds of terrible things could happen, and people don't question that. They're like, well, yeah, but you got to go to school. The moment you're trying something outside the box, whether it's unschooling or self-directed, then it's all of a sudden held to such a higher standard of it has to be this, and this. It's considered risky when really it is not more risky in my view. So. And also, this is related to something like this is in some of your writing, and I think you've mentioned it some other places, but the idea of support and freedom, like that really resonated with me when I saw that. Can you talk a little bit about like, what is support? What is free? What do we mean by support? What do we mean by freedom? Is there a way we can have both regardless of age?
Yeah, so in our society, we kind of have this support freedom dichotomy, this idea that if someone is in need of a lot of support, they therefore can't be trusted with freedom or given autonomy, or that if somebody has a ton of freedom, such as a quote unquote legal adult, a legal full person, then they don't deserve that much support, that they're kind of on their own. So again, we see this with kids, we see it with disabled people, we see it with a lot of different marginalized populations where if someone is not capable of living quote unquote independently, of course, none of us are actually independent, right? We all rely on streets being paved, people delivering groceries to our grocery store, people taking care of us. Like everything we do is dependent on other people. But there's this idea of independence and legal adulthood that is that you work a full-time job, you live alone, or you can live alone, or maybe if you don't live alone, then you have a spouse whose labor is devalued and they're kind of making it possible for you to live and go to work. If you're that kind of person, you supposedly have kind of limitless freedom over what happens to your life and your body, but that is called into question the moment you get in a car accident and become disabled, have a stroke, realize you're neurodivergent, have some kind of anxiety attack or suicide ideation. And it's all over how we treat kids. It's almost like I really think there's this envy in our society where there's so little support that we give to most people, and we tell most people you need to be on your own and do everything independently. And so people look at the care that in theory we give to kids, and of course a lot of kids aren't actually treated with that kind of love and care that they need, but they look at the support that kids have and they think that's so easy. They don't have to work a job, they don't have to do all the chores, they don't have to make all these decisions, they have it so easy, and therefore they don't deserve freedom. And I think it really speaks to just how much we're all actually kind of denied both of those things. Like, we don't actually have a lot of freedom in society. There are a lot of limits on the choices that we make, and there's so little support, so few resources out there if you are poor and struggling. And so everybody feels like these things are some kind of zero-sum game where they have to really fight and claw for whatever respect they can get and status they can get. But it's all built on this idea of, if you need support, then you're not a full person and you can't be trusted.
That just really, I don't want to like derail this to being about my very specific history and soapboxes, but the college that I went to that I mentioned was an early college that admitted full-time students after 10th grade, and it shut down. And in conversations with alumni around that, the like support, freedom dichotomy ended up being a huge way of how we talked about that without even realizing it. Of like, a lot of alumni blamed the school for not having enough support for them, but they used it in the language of, they gave us too much freedom. And
very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you've already been talking about it a lot. Disability and queer theory are kind of necessary for youth rights. One of your pieces talks about like how queer adults are not really allowed to interact with kids and I experienced this as a young teenager of like, my uncle still blames me for the fact that one of his kids is queer because I like mentioned that I had a girlfriend to her when I was 13. I guess my question is like, can you speak more about how like those specific aspects are intertwined?
Yeah. So some of it goes back a little bit to that thing that we already talked about how any choice that kind of diverges from the societal norm is seen as more risky and dangerous. And so there's this idea that we almost in society have to protect children from exposure to those risky, dangerous ideas. Those risky, dangerous ideas are just anything that is counter to the current societal norm. There's this writer, Lee Edelman, who has this book called No Future, that is about how in mainstream society, children kind of represent the future of that society. And so children's lives and how children are raised kind of becomes the battleground for what the future of society is supposed to look like. And so childhood becomes this area where people, even if they don't think of themselves as very conservative or traditionalist, they really cling to tradition, that this is the way that I was raised, this is what I was valued to, what I was taught to value as a child, and this is what we need to teach to kids. And people can feel like, if kids grow up in an environment that isn't one mother and one father and going to church and going to school in a conventional way, all of society is just going to fall apart because it's going to look so dramatically different from what I had when I was growing up. And that makes me feel really like scared. And so I'm going to just kind of tighten the reins and try to replicate this like image of like a safe traditional childhood that I had or whatever. And so what that means is that any exposure to ideas outside of that is seen as somehow tainting a kid because it gives them options outside of the societal norm. And it's really bizarre logic, right? Like what you just shared, Ramon, that meeting somebody who's queer would somehow corrupt your kid and make them queer. Well, first, that's rooted in the idea that being queer is like a corruption, right? That it's like a deviation from the kid's natural state. So you've already got this assumption that being straight is a natural state. And furthermore, the idea that just being exposed to information is somehow dangerous is a very weird outlook to actually have about what your responsibility is to children, to like shield them from knowledge about the world. Like, how does that keep them safe? How does that protect them and empower them? So I have this piece that is kind of provocatively titled Interact with Minors. And it's about this idea that queer people, we are accused of being groomers. We're told that we are child predators just for simply existing and being adults that have sexual orientations and gender transitions. Those things are seen as inherently damaging for kids to even be aware of, even though kids are aware of heterosexuality everywhere that they go, in every pop song, every advertisement, every movie, every little joke that parents make about like calling a baby like flirtatious because they like smiled at someone, right? Like there's heterosexuality dripping in everything about how we raise kids, in the majority of the people in our culture. But any wisp of queerness, that is seen as somehow more sexual, more dangerous, and that it's somehow going to corrupt a kid. And it's purely because even if somebody would say that they aren't, homophobic or transphobic or whatever, they do see that stuff as less natural, and they do think kids are supposed to be kind of kept in this traditional way, and it turns us into like being cast as predators and as inherently more sexual than straight people are. And the real tragedy of that is that it means that queer youth don't get mentors, that we don't grow up getting to know other people like us. I think especially today on the internet, it is really perilous to even just try and be a resource for some isolated queer kid and just like send them information, answer their questions, tell them that things are going to be okay. Any even interaction between somebody who's under 18 and over 18 is seen as menacing. And that comes from real fears that people have and awful things that have happened. But it's not a realistic solution to say you should never interact with a child, or queer people should never be around children. That makes children more isolated and more vulnerable to abuse. And I think, unfortunately, that's kind of by design in a lot of ways, like that we have set our society up to kind of abuse kids into a state of ignorance and disempowerment for as long as possible.
Yeah, something I've noticed is that like some of the biggest this are like other queer people policing themselves, because like you interact with minors piece, like that is my favorite piece of yours, because I'm like, oh my God, it's not only me that's noticed this, because like I go to like a lot of spaces that are like very queer and neurodiverse but like very hostile to minors, and I was like so annoyed by that.
Yeah, I think it bothers me so much. I'm so glad other people see and care about it too. It really makes me feel more sane. And like, I think some of it is queer people. We are so afraid of being seen as predatory. We've absorbed so much of that shame, and then we turn it on each other, where we're so quick to try and make ourselves respectable and prove all those stereotypes wrong, that then we start self-policing in this way that's like we can't even look like we're doing anything that makes anyone uncomfortable ever, when just by virtue of being queer, we are going to make people uncomfortable. We are going to be seen as inappropriate to a lot of people. And so we can't define ourselves by like tiptoeing around, never ever doing anything that seems like it makes anyone uncomfortable or is ever inappropriate to some people's standards of what children should know. And I think we're also just like in a cultural moment that's so bad about this stuff. Like so I'm a millennial, and in a lot of my like more younger, like Zoomer kind of friends, I see that like they grew up with being exposed to an internet that was a very unsafe place, and had a lot of toxic messages and traumatized them in a lot of different ways. And they want the world to be safer, and they want kids to be protected from that, which is a noble impulse. But isolation, we know, does not keep people safer. It's when children are locked away with only a handful of adults they're ever allowed to talk to that they're the most vulnerable to being mistreated and sexually abused and all of those things that we're so terrified of happening to them, versus when children have a really rich network of people that they can learn from. They're able to know that something is messed up in how they're being treated and to seek help for it. But if you are, let's say, a Christian conservative who wants your kid to never transition or be gay, it's way more convenient to feel like isolating them is the only answer. And that's like a really big part of our political rhetoric. And it really scares me sometimes to see queer people kind of reproducing it and acting like our very existence is toxic, or being like minors are disgusting, children are disgusting. That stuff is so, again, it comes from a place that I understand that like, especially a lot of queer people, we might have had kind of the nuclear family pushed on us, that we were supposed to like get married and have kids, and we don't want that. But sometimes we turn our own like dysphoria at that onto children, and that is not their fault. Like, my family pressuring me to have kids is not kids' fault, and I need to kind of get over that so I can be a good person to kids, because they're human beings and they're my neighbors, you know. So yeah, it's such an annoying thing in the queer community that people struggle with that.
I saw a lot of that in person at my at early college, of that, because like the age range of students was like between 14 and 21 ish. And it was very queer population of students, because a lot of queer children, I think understandably, are more likely to want to get away from their parents 2 years earlier than is expected. But it meant that like that kind of culture seeped into the student population of like, oh, why are seniors interacting with freshmen? And it's like, there's 400 people here total. I don't know how I can avoid doing that.
Yeah, and why would you not want to, you know? Like, you can learn things from people younger than you. You can impart some of your own life lessons, and they can choose to take it or not, and then they're going to learn their own lesson because it's their own life. Like, it's, I don't know, like it's so sad that we silo people off in age. And I think we've like become even more and more like that as a society, with just even like people being so obsessed about what generation they're from, and like not even interacting across generations or seeing them as the enemy, even among, you know, legal adults or whatever. Like, we're so isolated from each other when we have so much we can learn from each other.
Yeah, I really noticed that. It does seem to have gotten worse. And I just think everyone has that much more to learn, like you're saying, when you can interact with people of different ages. But it is, do you have any ideas, like, how did we get here? Like, why is it getting worse? And is there anything we could do to sort of, you know, improve the situation, make it a bit more acceptable to have friends of different ages?
Yeah. Oh gosh. I don't know exactly how it got to the point that it is. I think people are getting more isolated in general over the last couple of decades, both just being driven
Mm-hmm.
into smaller and smaller, like physical car dependent communities, and like not having third spaces and things like that where people just interact with each other. And then I think social media and social media kind of marketing has made a lot of people think in terms of who is my target audience, and I'm only ever going to talk to that target audience, and like really draw these like boundaries, because the idea of generations came from marketing research in the first place. Like, that's where that came from historically. And so it's kind of only gotten worse as like everything we do happens on a marketing platform like social media. So I think that's part of it. But as to how to get it better, I mean, addressing those things, I think, is important, right? Like finding and building ways for people to socialize that aren't strictly social media, that aren't strictly like corporately censored and moderated, building spaces where people can just be in community with each other and look after their neighbors and trade skills and participate in community projects together is important. And I don't know, I think I like, part of why I write about this stuff is because I think it's become such a like taboo topic that like I wanted to at least say it. Like I knew it would be okay, that I would be safe talking about it, whereas a lot of queer people, if they started talking about it, they would be accused of being a predator. And so I wanted to kind of just open that conversation as much as I could, and like us all collectively have more of that conversation, and just like acknowledging like how badly we're isolated right now, and how disenfranchised. And I think finding shared projects is always the best way to connect across different aisles, whether that's political organizing, you know, community gardening in your neighborhood, starting up some kind of little anarchist skill share and learning a skill from somebody who's younger than you know, like reaching across those aisles, offering things, you know, thinking about what you have to offer to the people around you, I think is often a really good place for our isolation. So like, what skills do I have that I can teach to younger people in my community? Or how can I build ways for somebody who's 65 and somebody who's 14 to volunteer on the same thing and just be equals? You know, the more we can build that, the more, because I think people do crave it. I think people do want it, and they're getting sick of how isolated we are. So I think there is potential for these things to be redrawn, I hope.
Yeah, that I agree. That all sounds great.
I was curious because you teach at university, and I don't know how much of this is my own experience, but I mean, I keep seeing in my like kind of young adult age group, this kind of temporarily embarrassed adult attitude among I mean, older teenagers, like young people who are just recently out of kind of this legal state of minority of like, and I was wondering if in your work teaching you've observed anything, or I was also interested in like what practices as a teacher do you use that kind of implement these kind of anarchist and like youth liberation ideas.
Yeah, so my teaching is a little bit unique in that I'm in the School of Continuing Professional Studies. So my students have always been older than me. When I first started teaching, I was like 22, and all of my students were like in their 40s and 50s. And so now I'm getting closer to them. But I've been teaching what are called adult learners, even though most college students are adults anyway. For the majority of my teaching career, and that I think also kind of helped prime me to be ready for a lot of youth liberation conversations and talking about. I sometimes talk about like abolishing age as like a meaningful way of categorizing who someone is, because somebody's numeric age doesn't tell you much about their walk of life and what supports they need and so on and so forth. Being respected by people a lot older than me as an educator when I was younger, it was a feeling that I knew I wanted to impart to other people because I was never talked down to. I was treated as an equal. I could treat my students as equals. And so I try to let that flow to my other interactions. So I do some, like faculty advising for the Students with Disabilities Coalition, which is more traditional age college students, for instance, and some of the like Palestinian liberation organizing that I do. It's usually led and run by young college students. So that's kind of where a lot of that, where my role as an educator kind of is relevant to that stuff. And so much of it for me comes down to just trying to empower and uplift people because they know what they're doing. Like they're so sharp and smart. And sometimes I can offer some context of like, listen, I've been at this university for 15 years and here's some stuff they've done in the past. And so here's what I expect they're going to do if you do this action, or like if they tell you they're going to do this, here's why I think you probably shouldn't trust them. But ultimately believing that they know their present situation better than I know their situation, and that they're going to make the decisions they're going to make, and that they have the agency and the capability to do it. That's as much as I can do to kind of flip the power differential and just be in a role of like, no, I know this world is trying to make you feel crazy and make you feel like you're lesser, but that's completely wrong. And I'm just going to listen to you and learn from you. I remember I was at a Students with Disabilities Coalition meeting last semester where the one neurotypical in the room was this one girl, this 19-year-old girl, wheelchair user. And she was kind of holding court and teaching all of us different social skills about like, here's how you start a conversation and leave a conversation. And I was just sitting in the circle like, oh, really? That's how that works? You know, my autistic self, who's like barely learned how to start a conversation cold at 37, you know, like this 19-year-old wheelchair user who, because she's a wheelchair user and she's treated differently, she has had to learn how to kind of control the conversation because she's not always in control of whether she can move from point A to point B. And so she knew a heck of a lot more about social skills than probably I'll ever know, and was teaching it to us. And sometimes I think that's like the most important thing you can do is just listen and actually open your heart and mind up to like knowing that you don't know what's going on and being awed by what other people are capable of. And it's sad because in education, you don't see a lot of that. The university is very hierarchical. And yeah, I like the way that you put it about the temporarily embarrassed adult, that a lot of young people, they're desperate to get out of that state of being a minority, a literal minority, a minor, not a legal person, not a full legal person. And so they associate being a minor with all of these terrible things, with being like stupid and reckless and embarrassing and cringy and making dumb mistakes, when that's not actually what being a minor is. It's just that's just a state of oppression. But you just feel a lot of shame when you're being oppressed. Like oppressed people feel ashamed of themselves and they want to get out of it. And so then they don't want to be anywhere near it. And I think kind of a lot of us just carry that through to our attitudes towards children the whole rest of our lives, where we just remember feeling really disempowered and being made to feel stupid because of how we were treated. And so then we act like childhood or minority status is like inherently this embarrassing, shameful thing when it's not.
It's a type of oppression that like everyone goes through. We all start out experiencing that shame of being oppressed, but then we all like then rise above it and then become the oppressor. So like I think like that whole like life cycle I think is honestly where a lot of different forms of oppression come from, is, you know, dealing with that shame you had as a kid.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting demonstration of the fact that like once you get privilege, the temptation to just like cut the rope beneath you. We do the same thing to kids, every single one of us. It's wild, but it really shows you how much like the circumstances you're in really shape how you move through the world and how you think about people. Because the second you get a taste of that privilege, you can be like, oh, I'm suddenly immediately better than this whole segment of the population that's under 18 that I was literally just a part of. Like, and we all do it. Like I was a complete like jerk as a high school student who like thought I was, you know, in 12th grade better than 10th graders or whatever, like this ego. Because I think maybe because our society is so hierarchical, we're taught like your status is everything. And so when you get it, you feel like it makes you a better person, even though obviously it doesn't.
Another thing I remember about Simon's Rock was like, I remember certain like alumni who came back to visit, or like people who were like interacted with Simon's Rock students versus high school students who were the same age and would gush about how much more mature these college students are than the high school students that they work with. And it's like, well, they're in an environment where they are allowed autonomy. I like that so much of the narrative around how that school marketed itself was around like, oh, the students who are ready to move on and the students who are exceptional in this way can do this because they're ready, rather than the idea that all students should have this kind of autonomy, which is what the school was founded on. I was very lucky to have this experience of, certainly in terms of like socially and how I was able to navigate my own life, I had this experience of being given autonomy and community at age 16. And
No, I think it's really telling too, though, because that even in that environment, people can have those attitudes kind of take shape. And I think also like what you're talking about, it really demonstrates that autonomy is a skill you learn to practice, right? Part of why young people make supposedly reckless decisions is because they haven't been given much time to practice exercising their autonomy. And when you first get it, it's Rumspringa. You test the limits, you test the boundaries, and you learn through that who you are and what feels good to you. And how are you going to find that unless you hit those bumpers? And it's not like, oh, you're so gifted and so then you're allowed to have freedom, right? It's using your freedom, it takes practice. And the more we give people the tools to do it, the better they get at harnessing that freedom in a way that works for them.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's kind of the idea behind self-directed education. And for a while, Imogen and I had a group, just a small group that of homeschoolers that would go around in public, flying squad. And the idea of it was we're all equal regardless of age. And it was a place where teenagers could make decisions about how to spend the time. We just did simple things. I know, like, there's definitely this expectation of people outside the group that like I'm in charge or I'm going to be responsible. But like, I think as an adult, just trying to not take that on and just be a member of the group was really wonderful. And then it's freeing for me as the adult to like, now I can be silly, now I can have fun, like you were saying earlier. Like, I think a lot of the judgment of younger people is envy, really. It's kind of like, oh, that's dumb. But like, wouldn't it be fun to just be able to play and have fun? It is freeing to everyone. But as the person who has more societal power, it just takes that effort to like constantly be aware of that, how that's operating, and try to minimize it as possible. So
Yeah, gosh, the more we talk about this stuff, the more I see how different things are kind of interwoven. Because in what you're just saying about like this kind of the privilege and the burden, right, of adulthood, where like I can't be silly, I have to maintain this privilege. It makes me think of masculinity in a lot of ways. Like to hold on to the power that is masculinity, you can't be expressive, you can't cry, you can't be silly, you can't wear fun, colorful things, you know, like that. It's so much about like how hierarchies maintain themselves is by kind of not allowing you to be like a free, expressive person. And I think even about ableism too, and what you were talking about, that so much of what disabled people we get hit with is you're childish, right? Like you have immature tastes because you like cartoons or because you sleep in because you're tired, right? Like that's the way we hit people with their marginalization, is to say that they're childlike and to use that as an insult. And usually what people mean when they say childlike is you're expressing your emotions, you like things, you're silly, like you're able to play around with things, you're a little bit irreverent to society. Like there's so many things about that are so good, and yet we demonize all of it.
Yeah, the connection to masculinity is absolutely, like, growing up non-binary, and especially like being a non-binary teenager, I like a lot of my dysphoria was around like signifiers of immaturity rather than any like masculinity or femininity wasn't really a part of the way that I experienced it. I went on testosterone because I wanted a lower voice that would not be read as a child's voice. That I think that there's absolutely this parallel here as to how like maturity and adulthood are this kind of the social state of privilege and like a social role that like can close off other experiences. That I've been trying to kind of deconstruct that in my own mind of like, how do I allow myself to be seen as immature and be secure in that.
And I think I noticed that neurodivergent people are much more likely to like not feel like they match the chronological age.
Yeah, I think both queer people and neurodivergent people, we exist on a different timeline of like we're not hitting the life milestones that people say are synonymous with adulthood, and of course they're completely arbitrary and made up, and most human beings historically have not like gotten married at whatever age and finished school at whatever age. All of these things are completely made up, and across cultures they're not even true. But yeah, I think a lot of neurodivergent people were hit with you're childish for how you express emotions, what supports you need, what interests you have. And that's so beautiful and cool that like we can think of these things outside of just you need to have a certain like set of personality characteristics based on how long you've been on the planet, which really makes no sense.
Yeah. And you wrote about the study that found now that like not only do you have to be 25, but maybe now it's 32 when your brain is finally going to be an adult. So
Oh, it's so frustrating how this study is getting reported on. So what the researchers found was just that, and I'll try to keep this rant brief.
yeah.
But they
No,
were
go
just
for
like
it.
they were looking at like neurological changes across the lifespan. And what the researchers found was that essentially we can kind of break cognitive development in neurotypical brains, because they did not look at any neurodivergent brains. They excluded all of us. So, you can kind of throw out a lot of these conclusions, not applying to a huge segment of the population. But whatever, what they found from looking at thousands of neurotypical brains is that there's kind of eras or phases of development. They weren't saying, unfortunately, this is how it got reported in the mainstream press. They weren't saying that, your brain actually finishes developing at 32. One of the things they said was that connectivity and efficiency peaks at 32, and it drops off a little bit afterwards, and it's a little bit lower before that. And also there's all of these other neurological changes that keep happening, efficiency within certain areas that actually just increases and increases and increases until your 90s. So they actually are really just describing how the brain never stops developing. It goes through all these different phases. How our brains work are forever changing, which also kind of in theory should push back against a lot of ableist norms, right? That there is no one type of functioning brain, and also that there is no one adult brain. I think that actually should be the takeaway from the study. Unfortunately, because of everything that's like going on in our culture and people's ageism and stuff and adultism, people really just latched onto that study and reported it as actually your brain peaks at age 32. So that's really when you become an adult, which the implications of that are really troubling, because if we think someone is only an adult if they are at their peak functioning, what does that say about how we see humanity and how we see disabled people?
Absolutely. Even with the like people claiming that your brain's not developed till you're 25 was deeply frustrating to me and still is.
It's nonsense. I'm sure many people in this community are already very well aware, but that age brains finishes developing at 25 thing just comes from one part of the brain finishes getting coated in a fatty tissue that is like a conductant of electricity on average by 25. And the brain continues changing in thousands of other ways for the whole lifespan. So that was a completely arbitrary thing to say. That is what is the maker of an adult.
Yeah, you could probably pick any age that you want and then find something that changes at that age and be like, okay, this is what being an adult is. Pretty random.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, further connections to queerness, it does remind me of like people's benchmarks for what makes a man and what makes a woman are entirely nonsense. And like,
yeah, people want there to be some biological basis for a system of oppression because then they can just maintain it forever. And so there is no way to define gender based on someone's biology that contains every woman and excludes no woman, contains every man, excludes no man. Because it's not a biological thing. It's a complex thing. And the same thing with age. Like even talking about something like mental age in like the disability world, what does it mean to have the brain of a 3-year-old? That makes no sense. If somebody is 50 years old and intellectually disabled, even if they can read at a 3rd grade level, they have 50 years of life experience. So how are you going to say that they're the same as a 3-year-old? And what 3 years of life experience are we saying is the definitive 3-year-old? It's just a way to try and reinforce existing ways that we've categorized people.
Yeah, but yeah, if you have any more thoughts or if you want to tell us about, where we can find any of your stuff.
Sure, yeah. So a lot of my writing about this topic is at my Substack, drdevonprice.substack.com, and I also make video versions of them for accessibility. So that's just on YouTube at Dr. Devon Price. And as I said, youth liberation is honestly a new area of obsession for me. So I'm always looking to connect with more people who are like working in this space, writing in this space, looking to learn more. I feel like it is really this ground where so many other societal problems coalesce, and where so many conversations about oppression and fighting it have to start. So I'm just super jazzed to be talking about it with you all.
Yeah, it's been amazing to have you here. And I was just saying, but I'm going to say this again. So anyone that's in the Seattle area at all, Imogen and I, and maybe others from the Seattle Node, are hosting a watch party of Devon Price's video version of Abolish Age. And so we're going to be watching that and discussing it. It's going to be amazing. So please come to that if you're in the area. That is Monday, February 9th at Pipsqueak Gallery.
How cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we will see you, or you will hear us next time.